Sean Streeter lives on Southeast Wooding Road near Washougal, Washington, a small city just over the state line from Portland, Oregon, at the western gateway to the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. The Gorge, as locals call it, is a federally protected area in Oregon and Washington bisected by the Columbia River, the largest river in North America flowing into the Pacific, and one of the most important commercial and ecological waterways on the continent. Southeast Wooding Road and its close neighbor, Southeast 356th Avenue, are narrow residential roads on either side of Gibbons Creek, in the foothills above town. They are streets where children ride bikes, people walk their dogs, and the neighbors wave from their driveways. Adjacent to those two streets, carved into a gravel-rich hillside, sits the Zimmerly Mine. What makes the hillside useful to a mining company is just beneath the surface. Thick deposits of gravel aggregate, the crushed stone mixed into concrete, packed beneath road surfaces, and spread as the base layer under foundations, driveways, and railroad beds. Streeter worked from home, so he was intensely exposed to the noises of that operation. The clanking of mining equipment, the grinding of a rock crusher that ran constantly, and the backup beepers from excavation machinery that blared across the valley all day long. His neighbors faced the same problem. Jody and Paul Akers lived in the house closest to the mine, a property they had owned since 1997. For most of those years, the street had been quiet. Now, it was carrying hundreds of fully loaded gravel trucks every day. The dust those trucks kicked up settled over the neighborhood in a gray film and floated through open windows and doors into the homes themselves. Rachel and Zachary Grice had moved onto Southeast 356th in 2017, the same year the mining restarted. They had children, and those children could no longer safely walk or ride bikes on their own street. Karen Streeter said she and her husband couldn't walk their dogs on the road they lived on. The noise from the crusher ran until 10 p.m. on many nights. Less than a mile downhill from the mine, Gibbons Creek drains the hillside and flows south through Steigerwald Lake National Wildlife Refuge, a federally protected wetland that provides critical habitat for migrating waterfowl and endangered Chinook salmon. What happens on the Zimmerly property doesn't stay on the Zimmerly property. Contamination from the mine moves the way water always moves, downhill, finding every gap in the soil and rock, carrying everything it touches toward whatever lies below. The mine had operated before. In the 1970s and again in the 1990s, when the Gorge Commission approved the family's application to resume mining. The Zimmerly family had constructed illegal drainage channels on the property, channels that ran from the mine's settling ponds, the containment system designed to keep toxic mining runoff out of waterways, down toward Gibbons Creek. In the winter of 1996 and 97, heavy rains swept through Clark County, triggering landslides across the area. The settling ponds overflowed, and millions of gallons of toxic runoff escaped the site and made their way to Gibbons Creek, destroying endangered salmon habitat and spreading into the wildlife refuge below. After that, the mine went dormant. For nearly 2 decades, the hillside above Southeast 356th Avenue was silent. Then, in 2017, a mining company with a track record of land use violations discovered there was still gravel in that hill. And now, after more than a decade of inactivity, the mine was running again. You're listening to Ecocide, a podcast about environmental disaster. Each episode investigates a moment when human activity collided with the natural world and follows what happened next and who was left to deal with the fallout. To understand why a gravel pit on a residential street became a decades-long legal fight, you need to understand what the Columbia River Gorge is and what it took to protect it. The Gorge is a canyon up to 4,000 feet deep, carved through the Cascade Mountains over millions of years by the Columbia River as it cuts westward to the Pacific Ocean. It is one of the most geologically and ecologically dramatic landscapes in North America, with views of the volcanic peaks of the Cascades, Mount Hood, Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Jefferson, visible from vantage points along its length. The western end is wet with mossy forests and a higher concentration of waterfalls than anywhere else in the country. The eastern end is dry, with basalt cliffs and rolling grasslands in a high desert landscape that looks nothing like the temperate rainforest a half-hour's drive to the west. The gorge is where those two worlds collide. Rainfall varies by a factor of 5 from one end to the other, and at least 15 endemic wildflowers and one salamander found nowhere else on Earth thrive in the microhabitats scattered throughout the canyon. That collision of climates produces something else as well. One of the best wildflower viewing destinations in North America, with blooms that move from the wet western slopes to the dry eastern grasslands each spring. The gorge begins at the eastern edge of the metropolitan area comprised of Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, which means it is one of the most accessible natural wonders in the U.S. More than 4 million people live within an hour's drive of its western boundary, and by the late 1970s, that proximity was starting to cause serious problems. Developers were pushing into the gorge. Subdivisions were being proposed on fragile ridgetops. Gravel mining was expanding. Clear-cut logging was eating into the ridgelines visible from the river. The fear among people who cared about the place was that the same sprawl consuming the suburbs would consume the gorge. The gorge couldn't become a national park. Too many people already lived there, and too much of the land was privately owned. So Congress turned to a different tool, a National Scenic Area designation that applied to both public and private land on both sides of the river in 2 states at once. It was an unprecedented application of that authority, and getting there required someone willing to fight for it. That person turned out to be a Portland architect named John Yon, though not in the way you might expect. Yon had been trying to protect the gorge for decades, but by the late 1970s, he realized his approach wasn't working. He'd spent years personally lobbying politicians and working his connections, but it hadn't been enough. He'd famously lost his temper at Oregon Governor Vic Atiyeh over what he'd considered a do-nothing approach to gorge protection, and that hadn't helped his cause. Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, whose support would be essential to any federal legislation, had told advocates what a successful campaign would require: a broad citizen coalition with prominent supporters from both Oregon and Washington, both Democrats and Republicans. Yon recognized that he wasn't the person to build that coalition. He needed someone with a social reach and a temperament he didn't have. Someone cooler, calmer, and more effective at bringing people together. There was a family history in Yon's devotion to the gorge. His father, a timber baron named John B. Yon, had volunteered to oversee construction of the Columbia River Highway, the historic road that first opened the canyon to the public in the early 20th century. The son had spent decades trying to ensure that his father's road, and the beauty it made accessible, wouldn't be destroyed by its own popularity. Now the threat was more urgent than ever, and Yon had come to understand that his own methods weren't up to the challenge. He needed someone else to lead. He had heard about a woman named Nancy Russell. She was a stay-at-home mother with no political experience and no background in advocacy or fundraising. On paper, she was an unlikely candidate to lead one of the most fiercely contested conservation battles of the decade. But Yon hadn't sought her out because of her resume. She was an amateur gorge botanist who had spent years learning the flora of the canyon on her own, and who gave popular slide lectures on the gorge's wildflowers that helped convince Portland audiences that the gorge had to be protected. She had the social connections that the coalition would require, and a natural ability to bring people together around something they loved. She knew the gorge the way Yon knew it, not as a policy problem, but as a place. She was, by all accounts, impossible to discourage. In August 1979, Yon invited Russell and her husband Bruce to dinner at the Shire, his 75-acre riverfront property directly across the Columbia from Multnomah Falls, Oregon's tallest waterfall, a 620-foot double cascade that draws more than 2 million visitors a year and is the most visited natural site in the Pacific Northwest. Yon canceled the first dinner, worried the evening light wouldn't be right. He canceled the second dinner for the same reason. The third time, the conditions were what he'd been waiting for. As the sun set and turned the gorge walls pink, Yon laid out his case over a picnic dinner on a grass berm he had shaped, over decades, into a gentle amphitheater facing the water. Russell described the evening as superb, and she left the Shire ready to lead the fight. Within months, she'd founded a nonprofit advocacy group called Friends of the Columbia River Gorge, recruited a well-connected board, and began building the broad coalition Hatfield had said would be necessary. As detailed in Bowen Blair's biography of Russell, A Force for Nature, the goal was federal legislation that would protect the gorge as a defined area, apply on both sides of the river, cover both public and private land, and have real teeth. The ability to limit development, require permits, and enforce standards. But what they were proposing was, to rural gorge communities, an act of war. The gorge's cultural geography made the fight especially vicious. On one side was Portland and its suburbs with urban environmentalists. On the other, farming and timber towns in small counties that had built their economies around logging and agriculture, and wanted no part of federal oversight telling them what they could and couldn't do on their own land. Residents and elected officials weren't just skeptical of the proposed federal regulation, they were furious. The law would apply to roughly 293,000 acres across 6 counties, and about 70% of that land was privately owned. To people who'd lived, worked, and owned land in the gorge for generations, it felt like having a bureaucracy dropped on top of their property without their consent, designed by big city lawyers and environmentalists who didn't live there, didn't work the land, and didn't have to answer to anyone who did. Russell was vilified. Bumper stickers appeared across the region reading, "Save the Gorge from Nancy Russell." She received threatening phone calls. Her tires were slashed. Eventually, the threats became aimed at her life. Local residents, elected officials, and the timber industry all organized against her. And she wasn't just fighting them, she was fighting the governors of both states. That's the part that often gets left out of the story. This wasn't a battle between conservationists and a few angry ranchers. The governors of Oregon and Washington both opposed the legislation. Most Gorge residents opposed it. The Reagan administration opposed it, and 3 of Reagan's own cabinet secretaries urged him to veto it. While the legislation crawled through Congress, Russell fought on every front available. When Skamania County approved several high-profile subdivisions on some of the gorge's most dramatic land, Friends of the Columbia Gorge filed lawsuits, recruited pro bono attorneys, and raised money for court costs to slow development while the law was still being written. She worked with the Trust for Public Lands to buy critical parcels outright, industrial sites and subdivision lots at the gorge's western entrance, because she understood that litigation buys time, but only land acquisition buys permanence. It took 6 years of lobbying, but the bill passed both chambers in October 1986 and landed on President Reagan's desk. With 3 of his own cabinet secretaries urging him to veto it, Reagan was inclined to do exactly that. He called Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, the bill's key champion in the Senate, to tell him so. Hatfield listened patiently, said he understood, and then mentioned that his Senate Appropriations Committee was backed up with funding requests and that some of the president's priorities might be delayed indefinitely. Reagan's top priority at the time was his Star Wars missile defense program, which required Hatfield's committee to fund it. The senator then wished the president a good night and hung up. His strategy worked. On November 17, 1986, Reagan signed the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Act into law, just hours before the end of the congressional session would have killed it through a pocket veto. The act established 292,500 acres of protected land on both sides of the Columbia River. It was the nation's second National Scenic Area ever designated, and by far the largest. The reaction in the gorge was immediate. At the Skamania County Courthouse in Stevenson, Washington, the American flag was lowered to half-staff in a symbolic gesture of mourning what they believed was the death of their rights as landowners. Klickitat County took its opposition further than symbolism. Of the 6 counties covered by the act, 5 adopted their own local ordinances to implement the federal management plan. Klickitat never did. To this day, all development applications in the parts of Klickitat County inside the scenic area go directly to the Gorge Commission, and because of that, the county remains ineligible for the economic development funding the Act provides to the other counties. The Act created a new bi-state agency to oversee it, the Columbia River Gorge Commission. The commission is made up of 12 appointed commissioners representing the governments of Oregon, Washington, and the 6 counties within the National Scenic Area. Its job is to develop and enforce a management plan for public and private land within the scenic area boundaries. The U.S. Forest Service manages the federal land. Together, the two bodies are supposed to ensure that the gorge's scenic, natural, cultural, and recreational resources are protected from incompatible development. Now, let's get back to the mine. The keyword in that sentence is incompatible. Gravel mining is not automatically prohibited everywhere in the National Scenic Area, but it's not automatically permitted either. The Act established a zoning framework that determines where mining and other uses are allowed and where they aren't. Mining that predated the Act was accommodated, but only in areas where zoning permitted it, and only with the appropriate authorizations from the Gorge Commission or the relevant county. Operators cannot simply dig wherever and whenever they want without oversight. The Act gave the Commission authority not just to set standards, but to enforce them. The Commission's executive director is not merely empowered to act when violations occur, she is required to act. That distinction will matter a great deal in this story. The Zimmerly property is in Washougal, Washington, in the foothills above the Columbia River, just inside the western boundary of the National Scenic Area on the Washington side. From above, the mine site is unmistakable. It's a raw wound cut into the green hillside. The surrounding forest is dense with Douglas fir, Oregon white oak, red alder, and bigleaf maple, pressing in from every direction. And then the mine begins, and the trees simply stop. What's left is bare, tan earth, excavated terraces of exposed rock and dirt, and winding haul roads etched into the hillside. No green at all. From the air, it looks like someone took a giant slice out of the forested hillside and forgot to put it back. Directly to the south of the property, on the low land between the hillside and the river, lies Steigerwald Lake National Wildlife Refuge, a federally protected wetland and riparian habitat established in 1987 that provides critical habitat for migrating waterfowl along the Pacific Flyway and for several species of salmon, including endangered Chinook. Steigerwald is an open space with wide marshes of bright green sedgegrass threaded with shallow channels of water. In the right season, the channels catch the sky and reflect the peak of Mount Hood to the east. White Queen Anne's lace grows at the edges. Waterfowl move through in numbers that attract birders from across the region. The refuge has a stillness to it that contrasts with the drama of the canyon walls. By the time the refuge was established in 1987, Steigerwald had already spent more than 2 decades cut off from the river. In 1966, a dike was constructed to isolate the lake and drain its wetlands for agricultural use, diverting Gibbons Creek through a tide gate. The refuge was an ecological work in progress, a system still struggling to reconnect with the river it had been severed from. Flowing through the refuge and into the Columbia River is Gibbons Creek, a salmon-spawning stream that drains the hillside where the mine sits. That means that without proper containment, water, sediment, and contamination from the mine flow downhill into Gibbons Creek and from there into the refuge and to the river. In other words, it's exactly the kind of place the National Scenic Area Act was designed to protect. It's in the Gorge, adjacent to federally protected wildlife habitat, home to salmon spawning habitat, and visible from the river corridor that millions of visitors travel every year. The Zimmerly family has owned the property for more than half a century. The history of their mining activity goes back to 1972, when the family first opened a small mine to supply gravel for the local highway project. Since the National Scenic Area didn't exist at the time, state law required only a reclamation permit with the Washington Department of Natural Resources to conduct surface mining. The mine operated, supplied the highway project, and then went quiet as demand dropped in the mid-1980s. By 1986, when the National Scenic Area was established, the Zimmerly Mine had been inactive for years. But the new law would now govern what could happen on that property, because it set within the newly designated scenic area. In 1993, the Gorge Commission approved the Zimmerly family's application to resume and expand mining on the site. The approval came with a specific and significant condition. The authorization would become void if mining was discontinued for any reason for 1 continuous year or more. Between 1993 and 2017, mining on the Zimmerly property started and stopped multiple times. The court record would later establish that no mining occurred on the site for at least 10 consecutive years between 2005 and 2015, a period well in excess of the 1-year discontinuance threshold. Under the plain language of that authorization, the permission to mine had expired. Before we get to 2017, there's one more piece of the Zimmerly property's history that matters because it established a pattern of behavior that would repeat itself a generation later. During the mining that followed the 1993 authorization, the Zimmerly family constructed illegal drainage channels on the property. Those channels ran from the mine settling pond toward Gibbons Creek, creating an uncontrolled overflow pathway to the salmon stream below. To understand why that matters, it helps to understand what a settling pond is actually designed to do. The water that comes off an active gravel mining operation isn't just muddy water. It's a slurry of pulverized rock dust, fine silica particles, diesel residue, hydraulic fluid, and lubricating oils from the heavy machinery, all suspended in water that's been churned through an extraction process. Crushing rock also mobilizes naturally occurring heavy metals, iron, manganese, sometimes arsenic, into concentrations that would never occur in an undisturbed stream. A settling pond is the required containment system. The toxic mixture flows in, the solids slowly sink to the bottom, the heavy metals drop out of suspension, and only then is the clarified water released in a controlled way. It is a closed system by design. What it contains is never supposed to reach a salmon creek, a river, a wetland, or any other place where clean water means life. The problem started before the catastrophic failure that would define the case. From August 1995 onward, water from the Zimmerly site was already escaping the settling ponds and reaching Gibbons Creek. State wildlife officials documented turbidity in the creek, far above safe levels, by that fall, and complaints about siltation continued through 1995 and into 1996. The catastrophic failure came on November 19th and 20th of 1996. Clark County was hit by the highest recorded rainfall of the century, estimated to be a 50-year storm event. The containment wall on one of the ponds gave way, and millions of gallons of toxic runoff poured off the site. Imagine what it looks like from a salmon's perspective. The water first turns brown, then gray, then nearly opaque with a high concentration of suspended particles. The gravel on the creek bed, the clean, loose cobble where Chinook salmon lay their eggs, fills up from below as fine silt settles into every gap between the rocks. The gravel compacts and becomes something closer to wet concrete. Salmon eggs need oxygenated water flowing through the gravel to survive. When the gravel is sealed with silt, the eggs suffocate. Much of that sediment never left Gibbons Creek. It settled into the stream bed, smothering salmon redds, sealing the gravel, and permanently destroying nearly a mile of coho, steelhead, and Pacific lamprey spawning habitat. The scale of what entered the creek that winter is documented in the dredging record. The 1995 and 96 storm events required the largest emergency sediment removal efforts ever recorded on Gibbons Creek, accounting for 66% of all sediment dredged from the stream over an 18-year period. Workers were pulling mine waste out of a salmon creek for years. What didn't stay in the creek traveled further. It ran down Southeast 356th Hall Road, into the county drainage ditch along Evergreen Highway, and under that highway into Steigerwald Lake National Wildlife Refuge. A wetland suffocates the same way as salmon eggs, from the bottom up, as fine particles fill every gap and pore, and the living substrate beneath becomes inert. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service confirmed the discharge into the refuge and documented its effects on the species that depended on it: painted turtles, red-legged frogs, Columbia torrent salamanders, and the waterfowl that use Steigerwald along the Pacific Flyway. And it didn't stop at Steigerwald either. Gibbons Creek flows south through the refuge and directly into the Columbia River. From a hillside above a residential street, the dam has traveled the full length of the watershed to one of the great rivers of North America. Millions of gallons of toxic sediment had escaped the site. The Washington Department of Ecology and the Gorge Commission each investigated and each levied penalties. Ecology assessed a civil penalty of $97,000. The Gorge Commission, through the 1997 consent decree, required Zimmerly to pay an additional $100,000, $70,000 of which was directed specifically to the restoration of spawning habitat in Gibbons Creek. Together, the two penalties totaled nearly $200,000, the largest ever levied against a gravel operation in Washington state history. Zimmerly argued that the disaster was an act of God, that extraordinary rainfall excused the violations. The Pollution Control Hearings Board rejected that defense. Heavy rains, the board noted, are a regular occurrence in the Pacific Northwest. Properly engineered containment would not have failed. In the aftermath of the flooding, the Zimmerly family constructed illegal drainage channels on the property. Channels that created a permanent, uncontrolled overflow pathway from the settling ponds directly toward Gibbons Creek. The Gorge Commission issued a consent decree in 1997, requiring Zimmerly to seek land use approval for them, but they never did. After the fines, mining activity on the Zimmerly property stopped. For the better part of 2 decades, the hillside on Southeast 356th Avenue was quiet. The neighborhood mostly forgot the mine existed at all. Then, in late 2017, it came alive once again. The Nutter Corporation is a construction and mining company based in Vancouver, Washington. By the time Nutter began operating the Zimmerly Mine in late 2017, the company's track record of violations at other sites made the Zimmerly operation unsurprising to conservationists. For instance, at a 60-acre mining site in Cowlitz County, Washington, just north of the Zimmerly property owners Rob and Alessa Behringer had spent a decade fighting Nutter. Their allegations included claims of the company tracking oil over public roads, illegally transporting and dumping waste on the site, and continuing to mine for 5 years after their permit had expired. The county had sent Nutter letters asking for compliance for years. The hearing examiner who eventually ruled on Nutter's application for a new permit wrote that the neighbors were frustrated over the lack of county enforcement, and that approving a new permit after years of violations could be seen as nothing other than a reward for misconduct. Nutter received the permit anyway. Judith Zimmerly, the property owner, lives in Ridgefield, Washington, about 25 miles northwest of the mine site, well outside of the reach of the noise, the dust, and the truck traffic that her property was about to generate. She and Nutter didn't apply for a permit from Clark County or seek authorization from the Gorge Commission. The 1993 authorization had expired more than a decade earlier due to non-use, and thus no longer provided a valid basis for mining under the current rules. Zimmerly and Nutter didn't care, so they started digging. The community around Southeast 356th Avenue noticed immediately. Within weeks of the mining resuming, the character of the street had changed completely. The Akers family, who had lived in the house closest to the mine since 1997, had known the street as a quiet residential road. Now it was carrying hundreds of fully loaded gravel trucks every day. The noise from the mine itself, the mining machinery, the rock crusher eventually installed on site, the backup beepers from the excavation equipment, carried across the neighborhood from before dawn until late in the evening. The volume of heavy truck traffic on a narrow residential road had made the street too dangerous for anyone on foot. In January 2018, Clark County's Community Development Division took its first formal notice. Marty Snell, then the director of the department, sent a written notice to mine owner Judith Zimmerly and Jerry Nutter, informing them that the mine had no valid permit to operate, and no conditional use permit existed to allow rock crushing or other activities on the site. The letter told them to cease all mining activities within 10 days. They didn't stop. In late March 2018, Snell's office sent a more formal enforcement action, a cease-and-desist order signed by both Snell and Clark County Code Enforcement Coordinator Kevin Pridemore. The order was direct: stop all mining activities immediately. They didn't stop. Over the following months, Clark County issued 6 separate enforcement orders against the Zimmerly Mine operation, telling Judith Zimmerly and Jerry Nutter that what they were doing was illegal and had to stop. Each time, they kept going. Sean Streeter told reporters that the Nutter Corporation had behaved as though they were above any law or regulation that caused them inconvenience. In April 2018, county investigators specifically targeted the rock crusher, the piece of equipment whose use had been expressly prohibited. In response, Nutter temporarily removed the crusher from the site. When county investigators came to inspect, it was gone. Then, in July 2018, it came back. A neighbor with a drone documented its return. The photographs were sent to county regulators, to state officials, and to the Friends of the Columbia Gorge. Rachel Grice, who had watched this pattern unfold since the day her family moved in, wrote a letter to county officials after the crusher reappeared. She noted that families living within the National Scenic Area were required to go through lengthy and costly permit applications to do any work on their own properties. She asked county officials to hold Zimmerly and Nutter to the same standards the rest of the community was expected to meet. The request would go unanswered for years. As you'll recall, Friends of the Columbia Gorge is the organization Nancy Russell founded in 1980. It now has more than 5,000 members and a staff that includes attorneys and policy experts focused specifically on scenic area enforcement. Nathan Baker has been the lead staff attorney there since 2000. When the Zimmerly mining operation restarted in 2017, Baker and his colleagues began paying close attention. Baker connected with the Streeters, the Grices, the Akers, and other households who had been documenting violations for months and getting nowhere with county enforcement. Baker began building a legal case, reviewing the enforcement orders Clark County had issued and the county's persistent failure to make them stick. They began making a specific demand that went beyond Clark County. They wanted the Columbia River Gorge Commission to do what the law required it to do. To understand why this demand was so significant, you need to understand the difference between what Clark County could do and what the Gorge Commission could do. Clark County had issued enforcement orders. Those orders had proven, as a practical matter, ineffective. Zimmerly and Nutter had simply ignored them. The Gorge Commission had substantially more power. Under the National Scenic Area Act, the Commission's executive director is not merely authorized to initiate enforcement action when a violation occurs. The director is required to do so. That's the specific language of the statute. In a case where a county's enforcement tools had failed repeatedly, the Commission's authority was precisely what the situation called for. Christina Wolniakowski, who remains the Commission's executive director today, was at the helm when Baker and the community members formally requested that she take enforcement action against the Zimmerly Mine. Wolniakowski declined. Her explanation was that she functioned as a neutral adjudicator, analogous to a judge, and that taking enforcement action against a specific violator would compromise that neutrality. Baker knew that was wrong. The statute drew a clear distinction between two different roles within the commission's structure. The appointed Gorge commissioners, the 12 representatives from the 2 states and 6 counties, are the appellate body, the quasi-judicial function that reviewed disputed decisions. The executive director was the enforcement officer. Those were 2 separate roles, each with distinct duties, each created by the Act. Wolniakowski was collapsing them into one, and in doing so, she was inventing a neutrality obligation that the statute did not impose. But Wolniakowski's refusal to act had real-world consequences. It meant that while one of the most powerful enforcement mechanisms available for scenic area violations set unused, the mine continued operating. Trucks continued descending southeast 356th, the crusher continued crushing, and a clear message was broadcast to every landowner in the National Scenic Area. If you violate the rules, the commission doesn't care. In press statements during this period, Wolniakowski acknowledged the violation while deflecting responsibility for it. She maintained that the commission had followed its process as a neutral body and that enforcement responsibility rested with Clark County. In a story about regulatory failure, there is a temptation to focus entirely on the institutions, the agency that refused to enforce, the company that ignored the orders, the slow grind of administrative proceedings. But the Zimmerly Mine case was also a story about ordinary people who kept showing up. Sean and Karen Streeter had not moved to the neighborhood to become environmental advocates. They had moved there because it was a quiet street in a community they liked. When the mine restarted, they started attending county meetings. They kept records, truck counts, noise measurements, documentation of operational hours. They attended hearing after hearing, county hearings, Gorge Commission hearings, whatever proceeding was next in the sequence. They became, involuntarily, something like expert witnesses on the daily reality of living adjacent to an illegal operation that no one in authority seemed able to stop. Zachary Grice organized a petition opposing one of Zimmerly's later attempts to reclassify Southeast 356th as a public road. He gathered signatures from 6 of the 8 property owners on the road. Rachel Grice wrote letters and attended hearings. The Akers family filed formal declarations. At least half a dozen households in total actively participated in the multi-year legal effort. Winning a legal ruling is not the same as stopping the trucks. Every victory in this case, and there would be many of them, had to be followed by more pressure, more filings, more hearings before anything actually changed. By July 19, 2018, the neighbors had been warning county officials about the truck traffic for the better part of a year. The argument was straightforward. A residential road with 10-mile-per-hour speed limit was not built for hundreds of heavily loaded gravel trucks. At some point, the math was going to produce a consequence. It did. A fully loaded gravel truck descended Southeast 356 that morning, and the brakes failed. The truck hit the intersection at the bottom at more than 60 miles per hour. An intersection on Evergreen Highway, a major east-west arterial through Washougal. It crossed the highway and struck the BNSF railroad tracks beyond it with enough force to destroy a significant section of track. They were lucky. The outcome could have been catastrophic. Those tracks run directly across the route children take to reach Columbia River Gorge Elementary School and Jemtegard Middle School, the schools that serve the families who live on and around Southeast 356th Avenue. The truck crashed at 3:30 in the afternoon, but school was out for the summer. The neighborhood dodged a bullet. The accident focused attention on the mine in a way that months of enforcement orders had not. Friends of the Columbia Gorge used the incident to renew the demand that the Gorge Commission's executive director take enforcement action. And it set the stage for a formal legal proceeding that would finally put the question of the mine's legality before a hearing examiner. In the summer of 2018, the Zimmerly mining dispute came before Clark County hearing examiner Joe Turner for a formal ruling on whether Zimmerly and Nutter had the legal right to mine the property. The core of their argument rested on what lawyers call a vested right, a legal concept that refers to a right or entitlement established under an earlier law that a subsequent law cannot take away. The logic is, if someone had a legitimate permit to do something before a new regulatory regime came into existence, it's generally unfair to strip that permit simply because the rules changed. Courts recognize vested rights as a protection against retroactive regulation. Zimmerly and Nutter's version of this argument went as follows. The Zimmerly property had a surface mining permit issued by the State Department of Natural Resources in 1972, more than a decade before the Gorge Commission existed. That authorization gave them the right to mine whenever they chose, regardless of the new requirements imposed by the National Scenic Area framework. Under their theory, the one-year discontinuation clause had either never been triggered or was unenforceable. On August 7, 2018, Turner issued his ruling. He agreed with Zimmerly and Nutter, partially. He found that, under a provision in Clark County's code, Zimmerly and Nutter could continue surface mining on the site despite the lack of a current authorization. The county's enforcement orders, in Turner's view, had been wrong on the question of surface mining. But Turner drew a line at rock crushing. Crushing, he ruled, was a distinct activity from surface mining, a separate and more intensive use that the old authorization had not covered. The rock crusher had to be permanently removed. The ruling was a partial win for Zimmerly and Nutter on the mining question and a complete loss on crushing. For Baker and the community members, it was a frustrating result. But it was not a final one. The ruling could be appealed to the commission, which had the authority to review it and the enforcement teeth that Clark County lacked. Baker's public response made clear where he thought the case now needed to go. The hearing examiner had, he said, put the question squarely in the commission's court. The commission had authority to review Turner's decision. It was time for the commission to exercise that authority. In October 2018, Friends of the Columbia Gorge and the neighbors of the mine filed a formal appeal to the Columbia River Gorge Commission. Their hearing was scheduled for August 13, 2019. In the 18 months between Turner's ruling and the commission hearing, the mine continued to operate. The rock crusher was back, despite Turner's ruling against it. The trucks were still on Southeast 356th. The backup beepers were still going at all hours. The families who had been living with this for nearly 2 years were still attending hearings and writing letters and waiting. Nathan Baker arrived at the August 13th hearing and asked for 2 things: a ruling that the mining was illegal under both Clark County's code and the National Scenic Area rules, and an immediate injunction prohibiting further mining while any permit process played out. The injunction, he told the commissioners, was critical. Without it, Zimmerly and Nutter would simply keep going regardless of what the commission decided. He said that based on their conduct over the previous 2 years, he fully expected them to continue violating regardless of what was decided that day, unless there was an injunction. On August 13, 2019, 10 of the 11 commissioners present voted to reverse Joe Turner's decision. The ruling was clear. The mining at the Zimmerly site was not a legal use under Clark County's land use code. The 1993 authorization had been voided by years of non-use. The vested rights argument was not supported by the record. Mining had to stop. The commission voted for the ruling, but it did not vote for an immediate injunction. Commissioner Bowen Blair, you'll recall hearing Blair's name earlier as the author of the A Force for Nature book, asked for assurance from commission staff that steps would be taken to enforce the decision. Wojciechowski's response to reporters was the same as it always had been. Enforcement responsibility rested with Clark County. She would speak to the county. The county would work it out. Baker had predicted this outcome before the vote was taken. The mining continued into 2020. Nearly 3 years after the Nutter Corporation first started digging without permits, trucks were still descending southeast 356th Avenue. Zimmerly and Nutter didn't accept the Gorge Commission's 2019 ruling. They appealed to Clark County Superior Court. When that appeal went against them, they filed in federal district court. When that too went against them, they appealed to the Washington State Court of Appeals. At each stage, they raised the same set of arguments: that the commission had exceeded its jurisdiction, that their vested rights had been violated, and that various procedural errors had tainted the proceedings. At each stage, they lost. Zimmerly and Nutter petitioned the Washington Supreme Court to review the case, but it denied the petition. The active mining had wound down by 2020 thanks to the accumulation of legal losses, the runaway truck, and the sustained pressure from Baker and the community. But the legal effort to restart it did not stop. In 2020, Zimmerly's attorney filed a land use application with Clark County seeking retroactive approval of the unpermitted mining that had already occurred from 2017 through 2020 and permission to resume mining on the site in the future. Zimmerly and Nutter's lawyers made an argument that deserves its own examination. Their position was that the Washougal pit was one of the only reliable and readily available sources of gravel aggregate in Clark County, and that Clark County was facing an aggregate shortage crisis. Without the mine, they argued, infrastructure and development projects in the county would be delayed: roads, public facilities, and housing. Zimmerly's attorney, Jamie Housley, would later tell the Clark County Council that the county had fallen below 20 years of permitted aggregate reserves and that, given how long it takes to permit and open new mines, the clock was running. The framing was deliberate. This wasn't just a property rights dispute. It was an emergency. That argument ran into a practical problem. Even if the aggregate shortage was real, it didn't override the law. You can't mine illegally in a National Scenic Area because gravel is scarce elsewhere. The dubious shortage claim didn't address the jurisdictional question, the vested rights ruling, or the environmental review requirements. It was an economic argument dressed up as an emergency. The application also proposed to establish a formal mining haul road along southeast 356th Avenue. Under National Scenic Area zoning, a mining haul road in a residential area is a prohibited use. Not a use that requires a special permit or a variance, a use that is flat out prohibited. In anticipation of this obstacle, Zimmerly and Nutter hired professional noise consultants and submitted multiple noise impact reports to support their application. The exercise had a certain tragicomic quality to it. Each report attempted to demonstrate that several hundred fully loaded dump trucks per day descending a narrow residential road would not produce unacceptable noise levels. None of them could make the math work. In the end, no amount of professional analysis could certify that hundreds of dump trucks don't make a lot of noise. The application moved forward anyway, with the haul road proposal still in it. On June 8, 2023, Clark County hearing examiner Joe Turner, the same Joe Turner who had partially ruled in Zimmerly and Nutter's favor in 2018, issued a 72-page ruling on the permit application. Application denied. Turner cited 3 independent grounds. The application was incomplete under National Scenic Area rules, the proposed haul road was prohibited by National Scenic Area zoning, and that the project couldn't proceed without a full environmental impact statement. Today, the trucks have stopped. The crusher is gone. The backup beepers that filled Sean Strader's home office all day have been silent for several years. But the case is not over. On April 30th, 2025, the Gorge Commission issued its ruling on Friend's appeal, deciding in Friend's favor on the key legal questions. Zimmerly and Nutter did not appeal that decision. In 2024, Zimmerly filed a new land use application with Clark County. As of this recording, that application remains pending, though without a solution to the Hall Road problem, which National Scenic Area zoning prohibits on a residential street, there may be little point in pursuing it. The gravel is still in the hill. Whether it stays there probably depends on whether Zimmerly can ever find a legal way to get trucks to it. The Washington Supreme Court declined to hear their last appeal, but nothing prevents them from filing further legal actions as new issues present themselves. The history of this case strongly suggests they will not stop until every legal avenue has been exhausted. There is also the larger question of what was lost and what has been rebuilt in spite of it. The 1990s mining on the Zimmerly property left lasting damage to Gibbons Creek and Steigerwald Lake, damage to salmon habitat significant enough to generate the largest fine ever levied against a gravel operation in Washington state history. The mining that resumed in 2017 and ran through 2020 created new risks: sediment runoff, hydrological disruption, and the kind of long-term ecological damage to waterways that can persist for years after the machines stop. And here is what makes the Steigerwald context so significant. While the legal fight over the Zimmerly mine was grinding through the courts, one of the most consequential habitat restoration projects in the history of the Lower Columbia River was being completed in the mine's backyard. The Steigerwald Reconnection Project, completed in 2021, was a $31 million, three-year effort that reconnected 965 acres of Columbia River floodplain that had been cut off from the river for more than 50 years by a flood control levee built in the 1950s. The project removed 2.2 miles of that levee, restored Gibbons Creek to its natural meandering channel after decades in an artificial elevated canal, created more than 115 acres of new wetlands, and planted more than 500,000 native trees and shrubs across the site. It increased the Columbia River's available floodplain habitat between Bonneville Dam and the Willamette River by 19%. After the project was complete, restoration ecologists from the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership spotted salmon returning to Gibbons Creek, swimming through a natural channel in a restored floodplain for the first time in more than half a century. Beavers have returned as well. The creek, whose salmon habitat was destroyed by millions of gallons of sediment-laden runoff, is now flowing through one of the most ecologically significant restoration projects the Lower Columbia has ever seen. The restoration project sits immediately downstream from a mine that, if permitted, would resume operation in a watershed that is now home to returning salmon. Nathan Baker said that the illegal mining on the Zimmerly property has been the largest and longest-running land use violation in the history of the National Scenic Area, carried out by operators with an egregious track record of willfully violating land use laws and harming the environment. The Columbia River Gorge, he said, is a national treasure that deserves better. Nancy Russell died in 2008 after a battle with ALS. 22 years after the passage of the National Scenic Area Act she spent 6 years of her life building. She lived through the first chapter of the Zimmerly story, but not what happened next: the mine coming back, the years of enforcement failure, and the court fights. But the organization she founded fought all of it, from the beginning to wherever the end turns out to be. The act she helped create was hard-won. It created an enforcement apparatus that, in one notable and critical period, had a director who refused to use it, who invented a neutrality obligation and let a mine operate in violation of the law for years while she declined to act. And yet, the act worked. Not quickly or cleanly, not without the sustained effort of attorneys and community members who kept showing up long after the institutional machinery failed them. But it worked. The question the Zimmerly case leaves open is what would have happened if Friends of the Columbia Gorge hadn't had the resources to fight, if Nathan Baker hadn't been there, if Sean and Karen Streeter had decided after the first year that the fight just wasn't worth it, if the Akers family and the Grices and the other households on Southeast 356th had given up and moved away. In this case, none of them did. The law held because people made it hold. It always comes down to that. Every environmental protection that has ever survived long enough to matter survived because someone, an attorney, a neighbor, a homemaker who left a dinner party and started making calls, decided the fight was worth having. If you want to support Friends of the Columbia Gorge and the work that made this story possible, you can find links to that organization and others at ecosidepod.com/organizations. If you'd like to go even deeper, episode sources and transcripts are available at ecosidepod.com/episodes. Ecocide is an independent narrative podcast. Each episode tells the story of environmental harm, who caused it, and who paid the price. These are the stories about what humans do to the natural world and what it takes to reckon with it.